The dog hit the double doors at full speed. 110 pounds of Belgian Malinois, muzzle torn free, chest harness shredded at the buckle, moving like something that had been caged too long and finally remembered what it was built for. The emergency wing of Redwood Regional Medical Center erupted, trays crashing, a supply cart spinning sideways into the wall, a security guard throwing himself behind the nurse's station and yelling into his radio with the breathless, unconvincing authority of a man who had never once trained for this. Staff scattered. An orderly knocked a patient's IV pole clean off its hook. Someone screamed from behind a curtain. The animal wasn't attacking anything, but panic doesn't wait for confirmation. It just moves. The dog moved straight through all of it, past the chaos, past the noise, past the dozen people pressing themselves flat against every available wall, and stopped. It stopped in front of a woman standing at the medication cart at the end of the corridor. She hadn't run. She hadn't grabbed anything. She was holding a small paper cup with 2 white tablets in it, and she was looking directly at the dog with an expression that was not fear and was not bravado. It was something quieter than either of those things. She crouched down slowly. The dog was trembling, but not aggression, but something underneath aggression, something desperate. She said barely above a whisper, "Easy, Ranger, I'm here." The dog dropped its head. Its whole body shifted, the terrible coiled tension bleeding out through its haunches as it folded itself toward her, pressing its scarred muzzle against her knee. The corridor was absolutely silent. Then someone's radio crackled. Then someone exhaled. Then the silence broke into noise again, but different noise, confused, uncertain, the particular sound a room makes when it has just watched something it doesn't have a category for. Nobody moved toward her. Nobody said anything useful. They just stared at the nurse no one had ever paid much attention to, crouched on the floor of the emergency wing with a military working dog pressed against her like she was the only solid thing left in the world. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit subscribe and stay with me until the very end of this story, because it only gets more intense from here. Like this video, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's get back to Emily Carter and what everyone was about to find out about her. Emily had been at Redwood Regional for 11 months. She had come in February, when the snow still sat heavy on the Douglas firs along Route 9 outside Silver Creek, Montana, and the hospital was short 3 ER nurses due to a combination of resignations, a transfer, and one retirement nobody had planned for. She'd interviewed on a Tuesday, been offered the position by Thursday, and started the following Monday. No drama, no fanfare. She had good hands, clean certifications, and a reference letter from a clinic in Billings that said she was reliable, competent, and calm under pressure. That was what the paperwork said. The paperwork did not say much else. She was 30. She had brown hair she kept pulled back with whatever elastic was closest. She wore her scrubs slightly too large because she'd bought them during a period when she wasn't eating enough and hadn't gotten around to replacing them. She had a quiet smile she deployed at appropriate intervals, and she had a habit of standing very still when other people were losing their composure. Not because she was frozen, but because she had apparently learned at some point that stillness was useful, that it anchored things, and she'd never unlearned it. The staff had formed their opinions quickly, the way hospital staffs always do. Danica Ruiz, the charge nurse on days, had decided Emily was competent but strange. Not unfriendly, just contained, like she was always operating behind a thin pane of glass that kept everything at a slight remove. "She doesn't talk about herself," Danica had told someone in the break room once. "You ask her anything personal and she just kind of redirects. Politely, but she redirects." Dr. Marcus Osei, one of the attending physicians, barely noticed her at all in the first few months. She handed him what he needed when he needed it. She didn't make mistakes he had to correct, and she didn't ask unnecessary questions. He had privately categorized her as background competence, the kind of nurse who keeps the floor functional without requiring management. And then there was Victor Langley, hospital director, 53 years old. He had been running Redwood Regional for 6 years, and he had built his particular management style on a very specific foundation, knowing exactly who in the building would push back and making sure those people understood, clearly and repeatedly, that pushing back had costs. He had a corner office with a window that looked over the parking structure. He drove a black Audi he mentioned too often, He had the kind of posture that came not from confidence, but from the sustained performance of it. Shoulders always squared, voice always calibrated half a register too low, as though the room was always being recorded and he was always delivering testimony. He had noticed Emily in her third week, and not favorably. The incident was minor. She'd flagged a medication discrepancy in a patient file that turned out to trace back to a documentation error that turned out to trace back to a billing shortcut that Langley had quietly approved the previous quarter. She hadn't accused anyone of anything. She had simply flagged the discrepancy through the appropriate channel, noted it in the patient's chart, and moved on. Langley had pulled her into his office 2 days later. "You're new," he'd said. Not a question. He had his hands flat on his desk, and he was watching her the way certain people watch subordinates, measuring the distance between where she was standing and where the door was, making sure she understood it. 11 days, Emily said. Then you should probably spend more time learning how we do things here before you go making noise about documentation. Emily had looked at him for a moment. The discrepancy was in the patient chart. I'm required to document it. You're required to use good judgment about what rises to the level of formal documentation. A medication discrepancy always rises to that level. The silence after that was the kind that meant something. Langley had sat back and smiled, not warmly. Of course, he said. Thank you for your diligence. She had left the office, but something had shifted and they both knew it. After that, Langley developed a habit of inserting himself into conversations about her. Small things. A comment here, a correction there. He would stop at the nurse's station when she was documenting and ask questions whose purpose was not to gather information, but to remind her that he could ask questions. He had a particular phrase he returned to when she pushed back on anything. You're a nurse, not an administrator, or some variation of it. You're a nurse, not a department head. You're a nurse, not a policy committee. The word just appeared frequently, though always positioned so it couldn't quite be proven intentional. Other staff picked up on it, the way staff always do, not consciously, but atmospherically. Nobody was openly hostile, but she stopped being included in the informal conversations. She stopped getting the small social invitations, break room birthday cakes, the loose group that sometimes went to the bar on Route 12 after a difficult shift. She was competent, and she was present, and she was effectively invisible. She seemed to accept this without drama. That was the thing people couldn't quite figure out. She didn't complain, she didn't go cold and resentful. She kept showing up, kept doing the work, kept doing it correctly, and kept standing just a little too still whenever the environment turned hostile, as though she'd been in hostile environments before and had calibrated herself accordingly. She had been at Redwood Regional for 11 months when the military transport carrying a handler and his working dog made an unscheduled stop due to a medical emergency with the handler. The dog, a Belgian Malinois, designated MWD Ranger, 7 years old, 3 overseas deployments, was temporarily housed in a secure kennel on the hospital's lower level, while the handler was treated for what turned out to be a cardiac event. Standard procedure. Military liaison had arranged it. Security had been briefed. What security had not adequately arranged for was the kennel latch, which was older than it looked, or the fact that Ranger had been awake for 31 hours and was in an unfamiliar environment without his handler and was, by any objective measure, not coping. The latch gave at 4:47 in the afternoon. Boom. The security supervisor's name was Dale Pruitt, and he reached the corridor approximately 4 minutes after his radio went live with the first scrambled report. By then, Ranger was already calm, pressed against the floor in front of the medication cart, breathing slowly, his scarred nose against Emily Carter's knee, while she kept one hand resting flat between his shoulder blades, with the steady practiced stillness of someone who had done this before. Pruitt stopped in the corridor doorway. He looked at the dog. He looked at the nurse. Ma'am, he said carefully, you need to step away from the animal. Emily didn't look up. He's okay. Just give him a minute. That is a military working dog. He is not. We need to secure him. There are protocols. I know what he is. She said it simply, without any edge, which somehow made it land harder than if she'd been sharp about it. Pruitt spoke into his radio. Then he waited because the dog wasn't moving and the woman wasn't moving and rushing. Either of them seemed inadvisable. 3 minutes later, Victor Langley walked into the corridor. He was wearing his suit jacket despite it being nearly 5 o'clock, which meant he'd been in a meeting or had wanted to look official, and he took in the scene with the rapid evaluative scan of a man who was already deciding who was responsible for the optics problem in front of him. He looked at Emily. Then he looked at the dog. Then he looked at his security supervisor. "Get that animal secured," he said. "We've been trying, sir. He won't—" "Then remove the nurse first." Emily looked up at that. She met Langley's eyes across the corridor. She said nothing. "Ms. Carter." Langley's voice had dropped into the register he used when he wanted to sound measured, but also wanted everyone in earshot to understand that he was in charge. "You need to step away from that animal immediately. You are not a handler. You are not authorized to interact with a federal military asset. Step away." "If I step away, he'll escalate," Emily said. "He's dysregulated. He needs—" "Step away." She held his gaze for another second. Then she straightened up slowly, keeping her hand on the dog as long as she could. The moment her fingers lifted, Ranger's head came up. His ears went flat. The trembling started again, and this time it had a harder edge to it. 2 security guards moved in with a catch-pole. Ranger went sideways and hit the wall hard enough to shake the cart beside it. Someone yelled. The guards pulled back. Emily was standing 6 feet away with her hands at her sides, watching. "Mr. Langley," she said very quietly, "let me handle him." "You are done handling anything in this hospital today," Langley said. He turned to Pruitt. "Escort her out of this wing." "What?" She was standing at the end of the parking lot, her jacket across her arm, when Danica Ruiz found her 40 minutes later. Danica came out through the side exit with 2 coffees she'd grabbed from the break room and the expression of someone who had more information than she was sure she should share. "They've got 4 handlers in there now," Danica said, handing her a cup. "Dog won't cooperate with any of them." Emily said nothing. "Victor is telling people you set the whole thing up somehow." Danica said it carefully, watching her. "That you had contact with the handler beforehand or something? Nobody really believes it, but he's saying it." "Okay." "Okay?" Danica frowned. "That's it? He's basically telling the whole floor you fabricated an incident with a military dog to make yourself look—" "What else would he say?" Emily's voice wasn't bitter. It wasn't angry. It was just tired in a specific way that didn't have anything to do with the day. "He needs it to be my fault. So it'll be my fault. It doesn't matter what actually happened." Danica was quiet for a moment. "How did you know the dog's name?" Emily looked at her coffee cup. "Emily, that dog was classified transport. His name wasn't on any paperwork. I checked. How did you know to call him Ranger?" "Lucky guess," Emily said. Danica looked at her for a long time. "That's a terrible answer." "I know. Are you going to give me a better one?" Emily looked up at the hospital building. The lit windows on the upper floors, the emergency bay with its orange-lit canopy, the security camera above the side entrance rotating slowly through its arc. She looked at it the way someone looks at a place they know is about to change. "Probably not today," she said. Danica took that in. "They're calling the military liaison to come retrieve the dog." "Good. And Victor's filing a formal incident report with your name on it as the source of the disruption." Emily nodded, just once, like she'd been expecting it. "You're not even going to fight it? Tonight?" "No." She finished her coffee. "Tonight, I'm going to go home and eat something and sleep. And tomorrow I'm going to come in for my shift and do my job. And if Victor wants to make this a thing, then he can make it a thing." "He will." "I know." Danica watched her. "You're not scared of him at all, are you?" Emily didn't answer. She handed back the empty cup, picked up her jacket, and started toward the employee lot. "Emily," Danica called after her. "Where were you before Billings? You've never actually said." Emily paused. She didn't turn around. "Somewhere else," she said, and kept walking. What then? The military liaison arrived at 7 a.m. the next morning. His name was Captain Doyle Ferris, and he was 38 and wore the kind of neutral expression that came from years of dealing with situations that had already gotten complicated before he showed up. He had a tablet with documentation, a soft-sided case with handling equipment, and he had been briefed by phone on the previous afternoon's incident. He met with Langley first. Langley gave him the account he'd been refining since the previous evening, that a civilian nurse with no handler training had unlawfully interacted with a federal military working dog, that the dog's behavior was the result of her interference and not pre-existing distress, and that the hospital was prepared to cooperate fully with whatever review the military wished to conduct so long as the nurse in question was kept away from the dog. Ferris listened. He wrote nothing down. He said, "I see," at appropriate intervals. Then he went to see Ranger. Ranger was in a resecured kennel on the lower level. He'd been sedated lightly the previous evening. One of the military vets traveling with the handler's transport had come in and administered it, and had slept. He was awake now, and he was quiet, but the handlers who'd tried to approach him that morning had all reported the same thing. Flat ears, pulled back posture, the still controlled tension of an animal that wasn't going to break anything, but wasn't going to cooperate either. Ferris approached the kennel and introduced himself, the way you're supposed to, and Ranger looked at him with amber eyes that were measuring and unimpressed. Ferris spent 20 minutes with him. Then he came back upstairs. He found Langley in the hallway outside the director's office. "I'll need to speak with the nurse," Ferris said. Langley's expression tightened. "I've already explained. I heard you. I'd still like to speak with her. She's been relieved from active duty pending the incident review." "Is she on premises?" "A beat. She's scheduled for the afternoon shift." "Then I'll wait," Ferris said, and sat down in the chair outside Langley's office with the patient, slightly immovable quality of someone who had nowhere else to be and every institutional reason to be exactly here. Emily arrived at 12:45 for a 1 o'clock shift. She pushed through the employee entrance with her bag over one shoulder and her badge clipped to her scrub pocket and found Captain Ferris standing in the corridor with his tablet and his neutral expression. "Emily Carter?" She stopped, looked at him, looked at the insignia on his uniform. Something passed across her face. It moved through quickly, but it was there. Not quite recognition, or maybe exactly recognition, the particular kind that carries weight. "Yes," she said. "I'm Captain Ferris, military liaison. I've been assigned to assess the situation with MWD Ranger. I'd like to ask you a few questions if you have a moment." "I have a moment," she said. They found a small family consultation room off the main corridor. Emily sat across the table from Ferris with her bag on the floor beside her chair. He set his tablet on the table but didn't look at it. "How did you know the dog's name?" he asked. She met his eyes. "That's the question, isn't it? It's the first one." She was quiet for a moment. Her hands were flat on the table, not restless, not clenched, just there. "I've worked with dogs," she said carefully, "high-drive working breeds, in a professional context." "Military working dogs specifically? Because Ranger's designation is not public information." "I'm aware." Ferris looked at her. "Ms. Carter, I've been doing this job for 11 years. I've assessed a lot of situations and a lot of people in them. The dog wouldn't move for 4 handlers last night. He cooperated with you in under 2 minutes." He paused. "That's not luck. That's not a good guess. What I'm trying to understand is why a civilian ER nurse in Silver Creek, Montana, knows how to bring a classified MWD out of a dysregulation episode in 2 minutes flat." Emily looked at the table. She looked at the wall. She looked at the middle distance the way people look when they're deciding something. "I'm not going to be able to answer all your questions today," she said. "Can you answer any of them? I can tell you the dog is going to keep refusing handlers until he's not in that kennel. He needs a familiar environment or a familiar person. Right now, the only familiar thing he has is me." Ferris watched her. "Why are you familiar to him?" She didn't answer that. He opened his tablet, pulled up a file, looked at it for a moment. "I ran your name through our standard cross-reference this morning. Your civilian records are straightforward, nursing certifications, employment history going back to about 7 years ago. Clean record, good references." He paused. "Before 7 years ago, there's essentially nothing." Emily said nothing. "That's not common. Most people have a reasonably continuous paper trail. School records, state IDs, tax filings. Yours just starts 7 years ago." He looked up at her. "That's usually what a rebuilt civilian record looks like after a classified service history gets sealed." The room was quiet. Emily looked at him steadily. "You should talk to your commanding officer," she said. "Not me. I'm asking you. I know. She stood up, picked up her bag. But I'm not the one who can give you what you're actually looking for. Make the call, Captain. You already know you need to. She walked to the door. Miss Carter. His voice stopped her. Whatever happened before, whatever reason your record got sealed, it didn't happen here. You didn't do anything wrong yesterday. She paused with her hand on the doorframe. She didn't turn around. Tell that to Langley, she said quietly. She pushed the door open and walked back into the hospital, and Ferris sat in the consultation room alone with his tablet and the particular sensation of a question that had just gotten significantly larger. The incident report Langley filed hit Emily's personnel file that afternoon. She was reading it in the break room. Danica had pulled a copy because she was Danica and she had access to things. When her pager went off. Not her pager. The overhead. Code white. Lower level. Code white. Lower level kennel. All available security to lower level. Emily was on her feet before the announcement finished. She was in the stairwell before anyone thought to stop her. The kennel was chaos. Ranger had gone down. Not aggressive, not attacking, but seizing. Full tonic-clonic episode, body locked rigid against the kennel floor. The sound of it wrong and frightening even to the security personnel who had absolutely no framework for what they were watching. One of the military transport vets was on his radio trying to get guidance and looking frightened in the way that capable people look frightened when something is happening faster than their training prepared them for. Emily hit the kennel door. She was inside before the security guard at the entrance processed what was happening. She was on the floor with Ranger before the vet finished his radio call. Her hands knew exactly where to go. Supporting his head, clearing his airway, timing the seizure with the steady internal clock that was apparently still running despite everything, checking his gums for color while she tracked his breathing. She didn't have her kit. She was working with her hands and with the knowledge she had, and with the calm that had always been the thing about her that nobody could quite account for. I need diazepam, she said, without looking up. 5 to 10 milligrams IV, if you have it. And I need everyone who is not actively helping to get back. Nobody moved for a second. Then the vet said, I've got it, and went for his case. Behind her, in the kennel doorway, Langley arrived. He stood there in his suit jacket looking at Emily Carter kneeling on the floor of the secured kennel with her hands on a seizing military dog, and his face did something complicated that had nothing to do with concern for the animal. Get her out of there, he said to the security guard. The guard looked at him, then looked at Emily, then looked at the dog. He didn't move. I said, get her, sir, the guard said, and his voice had a quality in it that was not quite insubordination, but was definitely not compliance. Sir, the dog is seizing. She is not authorized. She's the only one he hasn't bitten, the guard said. The diazepam worked. It took 4 minutes. Ranger's body unknotted slowly, the terrible rigidity easing, his breathing settling into something ragged but sustainable. Emily stayed with him, one hand on his side, counting respirations. When she looked up, her eyes found Langley in the doorway. His face was doing the complicated thing again. She said nothing to him. She just turned back to the dog and kept her hand on his side and waited. Outside the kennel, somewhere in the hospital corridor, she could hear footsteps. More than one person. Moving fast. She could also hear, though it didn't quite register yet, didn't fully land, the particular thudding rhythm of rotor blades, coming down from the north, getting louder. The rotors were loud enough now to feel in the chest. Emily heard them through the concrete of the lower level and didn't look up. She kept her hand on Ranger's side and counted his respirations. 14, 15, getting steadier. And let the sound of the helicopter register as information rather than distraction. Military transport, not medevac rhythm, something faster, more deliberate. Whatever it wasn't here for the handler recovering upstairs. Ranger's eyes found her face. His tail moved once, not the full sweep of a healthy dog, just a small, exhausted acknowledgement. She pressed her palm flat against his ribs and felt his breathing slow another degree. You're okay, she said. Stay with me. Behind her, Langley was still in the doorway. She could feel him there the way you feel a specific kind of pressure. Not heat, not sound, just the atmospheric weight of someone whose presence is fundamentally adversarial. He hadn't left. He hadn't sent anyone else in. He was standing exactly where he'd been standing for the past 6 minutes, and he was watching her with an expression she didn't need to turn around to read. The vet, his name tag said Kowalski, crouched beside her with his kit. He was younger than she'd initially registered, maybe 26, and he was rattled in the way that young people get rattled when competence arrives from an unexpected direction, and they're not sure whether to feel relieved or embarrassed. "Vitals are stabilizing," she said. "Heart rate was irregular during the episode. I want to monitor him for at least another 20 minutes before anyone moves him." Kowalski nodded. "You knew the positioning. Most people grab for the animal during a seizure." "You don't grab," she said. "You hold the space." He looked at her. "Where did you—" "Carter." Langley's voice came from the doorway, flat and deliberate. She didn't answer immediately. She waited until she'd finished her current count. Then she stood up, brushing grit from her knees. "Director," she said, "you are not authorized to be in that kennel. You are not authorized to administer any intervention on a military working animal. You have been relieved from active duty pending—" "The dog was seizing," she said. "There was no handler. Kowalski was on the phone." "That is not your call to make." "I made it anyway." The security guard near the door shifted his weight. Kowalski kept his eyes on his tablet. Nobody in the corridor moved. Langley stepped into the kennel. He came close enough that she could see the particular quality of his anger. It wasn't hot. It was managed, which made it worse, because managed anger at this wattage doesn't burn out. It calculates. "Get out of this kennel," he said. "Go to your locker, collect your belongings, and go home. I will have someone escort you if necessary." Emily held his gaze. She was aware of Ranger behind her, aware of the vet, aware of the guard in the doorway. She was also aware of the rotor noise, which had changed in the last 30 seconds. Dropped in pitch, losing altitude, settling toward the roof. Whoever was in that helicopter was landing. "I'll finish my shift," she said. "You don't have a shift anymore." "Then I'll sit with the dog until a qualified handler arrives. As a private citizen." Langley blinked. It was a small thing, but it was there. The fractional hesitation of a man who had not anticipated that particular response and needed a second to locate his next move. "Dale," he said to the security supervisor behind him. Prewitt appeared in the doorway. He looked at Emily, he looked at Langley, he looked at Ranger, who had raised his head slightly at the sound of raised voices and was watching the director with the focused, evaluating attention of an animal that had spent years learning to read threat levels in humans. "Sir," Prewitt said, in the same tone he'd used the previous afternoon. Not refusal, just wait. "Escort her out of this kennel." Prewitt walked in. He looked at Emily with an expression that was apologetic in the way that institutional complicity usually is. He understood she was being wronged, and he was going to participate anyway, because the cost of not participating was too high. And he had a mortgage and a daughter in middle school, and this was the particular arithmetic of ordinary institutional courage. "Ms. Carter," he said. She looked at him. She nodded once. She crouched down briefly and put her hand on Ranger's head, and Ranger pressed into it. Then she straightened, picked up nothing because she had nothing to pick up, and walked out of the kennel. She walked past Langley without looking at him. She walked past Prewitt, past the security guard, past 2 nurses who had gathered at the corridor junction to watch with the urgent, helpless energy of bystanders who know something is wrong and have no mechanism for stopping it. Danica was one of them. Emily met her eyes as she passed. Danica's face was doing something tight and furious that she was containing with visible effort. Emily shook her head. Small, just enough. Not now. She pushed through the stairwell door and went up. Tut. The roof access door opened onto a flat section of the hospital's upper level that served as the designated helicopter landing pad. Emily had never had a reason to be up there. She stood at the base of the final staircase, 1 floor below the roof, and listened to the rotors wind down through the door above her. Voices. More than 2. The particular compressed efficiency of communication between people who are very good at what they do and have no patience for anything else. She started up the stairs. She pushed the roof door open. The helicopter was a military transport configuration, not a medevac. She'd been right about that. It was already powered down, rotors slowing, and there were 4 people moving away from it with the focused, ground-eating pace of a unit that has been briefed and has an objective. They wore service uniforms rather than combat gear, but the way they moved said what the uniforms said more formally. They were heading for the roof door on the far side of the pad, the one that connected to the administrative corridor. Emily stayed where she was. One of the four stopped. He was older than the others, 60 maybe. Gray at the temples and around the jaw, the kind of gray that comes from specific accumulated years rather than just time. He wore the insignia of a full colonel, and he stood with the absolute unconscious authority of someone who had never had to perform authority because it had simply been true for so long it had become structural. He had seen her. He was looking at her from across the landing pad, and something in his face was doing something complicated that she recognized, because she'd seen it in Ferris's face that morning, that same quality of a question that had just gotten significantly larger. Except in this man's face, it wasn't just a larger question. It was something else, something that had been waiting longer. She watched him take 3 steps toward her. She didn't move. "Carter," he said, not a question. Her jaw tightened slightly. "Colonel Ashford." The name came out of her like something she hadn't meant to say, except that she had said it because it was true and because pretending otherwise was not a machinery she had available anymore. Ashford stopped 2 feet from her. He looked at her for a long moment, not measuring her the way Langley measured people, not calculating the way Ferris had been calculating. Something different, something that had grief in it and relief in it, and something she didn't want to look at too directly. "We got the report," he said. Ranger's designation triggered an automatic flag when it was logged into a civilian facility, and then when the situation escalated, he stopped. "I had to come myself." "You didn't have to," she said. "No?" he agreed. "I didn't have to." He paused. "How is he?" "Postictal? Resting? Vitals stabilizing." She kept her voice clinical because clinical was the scaffolding she had, and she was not going to let it come down. Not here, not in front of 3 soldiers she didn't know and 1 she did. He needs rest and monitoring and a familiar environment. He shouldn't be transported until tomorrow at the earliest. Ashford nodded slowly. "And you?" "I'm fine." "That's not what I meant." She looked at him. "They filed an incident report against you," he said. "The director. I read it on the flight in." He paused. "He's calling you unstable. Says you interfered with federal assets and created a disruption." "I know what he's saying. Emily, don't." Her voice was quiet, but it had a warning in it. "Don't do whatever that sentence was going to be. I've been handling this." "I can see how you've been handling it. Then you can also see I haven't needed—" She stopped. She pressed the back of her hand briefly against her mouth, the kind of gesture that is mostly about containing something. Then she lowered it. "I built a life here, Ashford, a quiet one. That was the whole point. I know that. And now you're on the roof." He said nothing. "With a helicopter," she added, "which is about as quiet as it gets." Something almost moved across his face, not quite a smile. "We'll be discreet." "You landed a military helicopter on a hospital in Silver Creek, Montana," she said flatly. "Discreet." This time, the thing that moved across his face was definitely something like a smile. He contained it. "Come inside, what?" he said. "We need to talk to the director." "He's going to tell you I fabricated an incident." "Let him." She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked at the 3 other soldiers who had maintained their positions and their professional neutrality throughout and were staring at various non-Emily points in the middle distance, the way military personnel do when they're pretending not to hear a conversation. "You're going to make this loud," she said. "I'm going to make it accurate," Ashford said. "The loud is his problem." She exhaled. "All right." She pushed the roof door open and went inside. Langley was on his way to the administrative level when the elevator doors opened and he nearly walked into a full colonel and a civilian nurse stepping off together. He stopped. Ashford looked at him with the particular quality of attention that senior military officers use when they have already decided the outcome of a situation and are simply observing how the other party behaves before it arrives. "Director Langley," Ashford said. Langley's eyes moved to Emily. Something moved behind them. Surprise, recalculation, the rapid reassembly of a narrative that has just encountered an inconvenient data point. He managed it quickly. He was good at managing things quickly. "Colonel," he said, "I wasn't informed we'd have additional military personnel on site. I've been coordinating with Captain Ferris. Captain Ferris will be reassigned after today," Ashford said. "I'm taking direct command of this situation. We'll need a conference room, 30 minutes. Of course, I'm happy to cooperate fully with any review. I do want to note for the record that the incident yesterday—" "30 minutes," Ashford said. Langley stopped talking. Ashford looked at Emily briefly. She gave him nothing. No nod, no expression, just stood there with her hands at her sides, present and waiting. Langley looked at her. His face had rearranged itself into something careful and contained, and she recognized it. That was the face of someone who is rapidly recalculating risk, who has seen a variable change and is running the new numbers. She'd seen it before. She'd seen it in offices and corridors and briefing rooms and places considerably less comfortable than this hospital, and it had never made her feel safe. She didn't need to feel safe. She just needed to stay standing. The conference room was on the second floor, and it fit 8 people without discomfort. By the time Ashford's team assembled, there were 6 people in it. Ashford, 2 of his personnel, Langley, the hospital's legal liaison, a woman named Petra Holloway, who had the expression of someone who had been pulled from a budget meeting and was already doing triage, and Emily, who sat at the far end of the table with a cup of water she wasn't drinking. Ferris came in late and sat beside Emily without explaining himself. She noticed. Ashford set a tablet on the table. He did not open it. "I want to be direct," he said. "The purpose of this meeting is not to conduct a formal investigation. That process will begin separately and through appropriate channels. The purpose of this meeting is to clarify as clearly as possible the nature of MWD Ranger's connection to this facility and to Emily Carter specifically, so that any personnel decisions made in the last 48 hours can be reviewed with accurate information." Langley leaned forward. "Colonel, with respect, the nurse interfered with a federal asset, created a disruption in the emergency wing, and her behavior has been—" "Mr. Langley." Ashford's voice didn't rise. It just solidified. "I'll ask you to hold your comments until I've finished." Petra Holloway put her hand briefly on Langley's arm. He sat back. 7 years ago, Ashford said, Emily Carter served as a combat medical specialist with a classified joint operations unit operating outside standard military record-keeping channels. The nature of that unit's work required that all personnel records be sealed upon separation. That separation was not disciplinary. It was procedural, and it was intended to protect personnel who were returning to civilian life in sensitive contexts. He paused. Emily Carter's sealed records contain a full-service history, commendations, and documented field actions that are, to put it plainly, exceptional. Langley was looking at Emily. She was looking at the cup of water. MWD Ranger served with that same unit, Ashford continued. He and his handler, Staff Sergeant Marcus Tilley, who is currently recovering from a cardiac event in this facility, deployed alongside Carter's medical team on 3 separate operations. The dog knows her because she worked beside him for over 2 years. He responds to her because she is not a stranger. She is, by any reasonable measure, a known and trusted partner. The room was quiet. Petra Holloway was typing something into her own tablet. The 2 military personnel flanking Ashford were watching Langley with the careful neutrality of people recording behavior. "The incident report filed against Ms. Carter," Ashford said, "describes her as an unauthorized civilian who interfered with a federal asset and fabricated a false response to create the appearance of a capability she doesn't possess." He finally opened his tablet. He turned it to face Langley. "These are her service records. Relevant portions have been declassified for the purpose of this meeting under my direct authorization." Langley looked at the tablet. He looked at it for longer than necessary. He looked at it the way people look at things they were hoping wouldn't exist. "The commendations alone," Ashford said, "make her rather overqualified to manage a dysregulation episode in a hospital kennel." He picked the tablet back up. "The incident report, in light of this information, is not only factually inaccurate, it is institutional retaliation against a staff member for actions that were medically appropriate, skillfully executed, and in keeping with training that exceeds anything your hospital credentialing would require." Langley's jaw moved. "I'd advise you," Petra Holloway said quietly, and without looking up from her own screen, "to not say whatever you're about to say." He closed his mouth. Emily looked up then. She looked at Ashford, who was watching her with that thing in his face that wasn't quite professional distance. She looked at Ferris, who had his arms folded and was looking at the table. She looked at Langley, who was looking at his hands. "What happens now?" she asked. "Formally," Ashford said. "The incident report is flagged for review pending the declassified records. The military will submit a formal statement to the hospital's board regarding the nature of your qualifications and the accuracy of events as documented. Ranger's handler will, when medically cleared, speak to Ranger's history with your unit." He paused. "Informally. We're not done." "What does that mean?" He looked at her steadily. "It means the review didn't start with the dog." The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before. This one had mass to it. Langley heard it. Petra Holloway heard it. Emily heard it and felt something in her chest shift in the way that things shift when a sealed door has been opened by someone else's hand and there's nothing left to do but walk through. "What review?" Langley said. His voice had lost its managed quality. Just slightly. Just enough to be audible. Ashford looked at him. "The hospital board was contacted this morning. There are documentation anomalies in your facility's records, staffing incident reports, billing patterns, safety certification renewals that were flagged during a routine cross-reference triggered by Ranger's transport paperwork." He paused. "I understand it's a coincidence that surprises you. It surprised us too." Langley stood up. "I think," he said carefully, "that this has gone significantly beyond the scope of a liaison meeting, and I would like legal counsel present before—" "You have legal counsel present," Petra Holloway said, still without looking up. "External legal counsel." "That's your right," Ashford said. "The board review will accommodate your schedule." He closed his tablet. "But the flag doesn't wait." Langley looked at Emily. She met his eyes. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He looked away first. Shut. The meeting ended without resolution, and with the particular loaded energy of a room where everyone has understood that the real conversation has been deferred, not concluded. Ashford's team filed out. Petra Holloway left immediately after, already on her phone. Ferris held the door. Langley was the last one still at the table when Emily passed him. She didn't slow down. She didn't look at him. He said, very quietly, not loud enough for anyone in the corridor to hear, "You did this." She stopped. She turned. "You flagged the records," he said. His voice had lost the last of its management. It was just a man's voice now, not a director's. "You brought them here. You planned this." She looked at him for a moment, just a moment. "I plan to come to work, do my job, and go home," she said. "That's what I've been planning since February." She paused. The rest of it was already there. She walked out. In the corridor, Ashford fell into step beside her. He didn't say anything immediately. They walked to the end of the hall, past the nursing station, where 3 staff members were pretending not to stare, past the window that looked out over the parking structure and the Douglas firs beyond it. "The board is going to want to talk to you," he said. "I know. And there's the matter of your commendation, the one that was withheld when your records were sealed. There's a process for—" "Ashford." She stopped walking. He stopped too. "I need you to tell me something straight." He waited. "The documentation flags, the billing anomalies, were those actually connected to Ranger's transport paperwork?" She looked at him directly. "Or did you already know?" Ashford was quiet for a beat too long to be neutral. "We knew," he said. She absorbed that. Her face didn't change, but something in her eyes did. Not anger, exactly. Something more tired than anger. "How long?" 4 months. 4 months, she repeated. "We needed the right moment. The records being sealed complicated the—" "I've been here for 11 months, she said. "Getting written up and locked out of procedures and talked over in my own department, and you knew 4 months ago." He held her gaze. "I know. You let it keep happening. We needed the case to be airtight before we moved. If we'd come in before we had everything, Langley's lawyers would have—" "I know why," she said. Her voice was flat. "I'm not asking why. I'm just making sure you understand what it cost." He was quiet. "Okay," she said. She started walking again. I need to check on Ranger. He didn't follow immediately. He stood in the corridor for a second, and then he followed, because that was all there was to do. Behind them, at the other end of the hall, a door opened. One of Ashford's personnel leaned out and said, "Sir, the board chair is here." And she didn't come alone. Ashford turned. Emily turned. Coming through the main entrance at the end of the corridor were 3 people in civilian clothes, but not civilian clothes the way hospital administrators wore civilian clothes. These were the kind of civilian clothes that people wear when they're carrying authority. They don't need a uniform to communicate. Behind them, 2 additional figures in federal contractor credentials. And behind all of them, a woman Emily recognized. She had never seen this woman in person. She had seen her in a classified briefing document 6 years ago, in a context that had nothing to do with Silver Creek, Montana, and everything to do with the unit whose records had been sealed. Emily felt something cold move through her chest. This was not a board review. This was not about Langley's billing anomalies. This was something else entirely. Something that had been moving toward her for longer than 4 months, longer than 11 months. Something that had apparently been moving toward her since the day the records got sealed. And it had just walked through the front door of Redwood Regional Medical Center, wearing a civilian blazer and carrying a briefcase that looked entirely too ordinary for what was almost certainly inside it. Emily looked at Ashford. His face had gone very still. "What is that?" she said. He didn't answer right away. "Ashford." Her voice had an edge in it now. "What is that?" "That," he said quietly, "is why I came myself." The woman's name was Diane Sorrell. Emily knew it the way she knew other things she wasn't supposed to still know. From a document she'd read once, in a room she'd been told not to describe 6 years ago. Sorrell had been a name attached to a departmental seal and a signature at the bottom of a page that had reorganized 3 people's lives without consulting any of them. She was 50-something, lean in the way of someone who had been disciplined about everything for a very long time, and she moved through the hospital entrance with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had never once arrived anywhere without knowing exactly what she was walking into. She looked at Emily from 20 feet away, and she didn't look surprised. That was the part that landed wrong. Not recognition. Sorrell would have reviewed the file, would have known Emily's face, but the absence of surprise meant she had also known Emily would be standing in this corridor at this moment, which meant the timeline of this entire situation had a shape Emily hadn't been shown. "Ms. Carter," Sorrell said, crossing the distance between them without waiting for an introduction. She extended a hand. Her grip was brief and businesslike. "I'm Diane Sorrell, Office of Military Records and Personnel Integrity. I've been briefed on the situation here." "What situation specifically?" Emily said. Sorrell looked at her steadily. "All of them." Ashford had come up on Emily's left. He didn't say anything, but his posture had shifted. Not deferential exactly, but aware of a hierarchy that had just made itself present. "We should find a room," Sorrell said. Not a suggestion. The room they found was a small administrative office off the main corridor, someone's borrowed space, a desk with a family photo still on it, a whiteboard with a scheduling grid half erased. 4 people: Sorrell, Emily, Ashford, and one of Sorrell's personnel who sat against the wall with a laptop open and said nothing for the duration. Sorrell set her briefcase on the desk and opened it. She removed a manila folder that was thick enough to have weight. "When your records were sealed," she said, "the order came from a departmental level that did not at the time have the jurisdictional authority to issue it." She set the folder on the desk. "We've known this for approximately 18 months. The review process was slow, for reasons that are relevant but that I won't detail here." Emily looked at the folder. "What that means practically," Sorrell continued, "is that the sealing order is being formally vacated. Your service history is being restored to accessible record. Your commendations, your field citations, your medical certifications, all of it goes back on file as of the documentation I'm carrying today." "Okay," Emily said. Sorrell paused. "That's your response? What would you like me to say?" "Most people have more of a reaction. Most people haven't had 7 years to prepare for this conversation." Emily looked at the folder, then at Sorrell. "You're here because of Langley. We're here because of Ranger's transport flag, which Ashford already told me about the 4 months, Emily said. I'm asking about Langley specifically. You didn't fly in from wherever you flew in from because of a dog's transport paperwork. Sorrel held her gaze. There was something in it that was not quite respect and not quite appraisal and was maybe somewhere between them. Director Langley, Sorrel said carefully, has been under separate federal scrutiny for approximately 8 weeks. The hospital's documentation anomalies intersected with a contracting review that originated outside this facility. When Ranger's transport flag cross-referenced your name and Langley's incident report against you, it connected 2 things that had been on separate tracks. Emily absorbed this. He had no idea who you were, Sorrel said. When he filed that report, he wasn't targeting you because of your service history. He was targeting you because you were an inconvenient nurse who knew too much about his paperwork. I know, Emily said. That's almost worse. Sorrel looked at her for a moment. Yes, she said. It is. The laptop against the wall chimed softly. Sorrel's personnel looked up. The board chair is ready, he said. Sorrel nodded. She picked up the folder, then paused. She looked at Emily with a directness that had something behind it. Not warmth, not exactly, but a quality of acknowledgement that Sorrel probably didn't deploy often and meant something when she did. For what it's worth, she said, the people who authorized the sealing order are no longer in their positions. The review found multiple instances of irregular use of that authority. You were not the only one. Emily said nothing. I'm not telling you that to make it better, Sorrel said. I know it doesn't make it better. I'm telling you because you deserve the full picture. Emily picked up her cup of water from the desk. She'd carried it from the conference room, apparently, without noticing. She drank from it. Let's go talk to the board, she said. What? The board meeting was not in the boardroom. The boardroom was on the 4th floor and required a keycard Langley controlled, and Langley had not been asked to facilitate anything in the last 30 minutes. So the meeting happened in the largest available conference room, which was on the 2nd floor, and smelled faintly of the previous meeting's coffee, and it had 11 people in it by the time everyone was seated. Board Chair Margaret Voss was 64, former hospital administrator from Missoula, and she had the expression of a woman who had received a phone call that morning that had substantially rearranged her week and her opinion of several people she'd trusted. She sat at the head of the table with 2 board members flanking her, and when Langley came in, he came in with external counsel, a man in a gray suit who had driven 40 minutes from the nearest city and was still slightly out of breath. She looked at him without greeting him. Emily sat on the right side of the table, between Ashford and Ferris. Sorrel sat across from them. The external counsel put his briefcase on the table and said, Before we begin, I want to note that my client has significant concerns about the procedural. Sit down, please, Voss said. Not unkindly, just absolutely. He sat. Voss looked at Sorrel. You have documentation. I have documentation, Sorrel confirmed. She had the folder open. She did not perform the opening of it. She just began. What followed was 40 minutes that Emily would later struggle to describe in any linear way, not because she wasn't paying attention, but because attention has a texture when you are simultaneously the subject of what is being discussed and the person having to sit still while it is discussed in front of you. Sorrel laid out the service history. Ferris provided the technical documentation on Ranger. Ashford spoke to the operational context of the unit with measured precision, saying enough and not more than enough, which was exactly how she remembered him operating in every context she'd known him in. Langley's external counsel interjected at intervals. The interjections got shorter as the meeting progressed. The incident report was read aloud. Then the actual timeline of events was read alongside it. The discrepancies were not subtle. They were the kind of discrepancies that exist when someone has written a version of events specifically shaped to produce a desired outcome rather than to accurately describe what happened. Voss asked Emily 2 questions directly. Her voice was even when she asked them. Emily answered both without elaboration, without appeal, and without looking at Langley. At the end of the 40 minutes, Voss folded her hands on the table and looked at Langley with the expression of someone who has concluded a process she had hoped would go differently. Victor, she said, I've known you for 6 years. Langley's jaw was tight. I want to believe, Voss continued, that the documentation anomalies are administrative error. that the report against Ms. Carter was an overcorrection made in stress. I want to believe that. She paused. But the Federal Review doesn't operate on what I want to believe. And neither does this board, when a federal review is already active. She looked at external counsel. Your client is suspended effective immediately, pending the outcome of both reviews. His administrative access to hospital systems will be revoked within the hour. External counsel said something. Voss didn't look at him. Langley stood up. You're making a mistake, he said. He said it to Voss, but he was looking at Emily. Emily looked back at him. I've been running this hospital for 6 years, he said. Everything that works in this building works because I built the systems. The funding, the staffing ratios, the accreditation, that is my work. And you are going to throw it away because, Victor, Voss said, because of a nurse who has been here for 11 months. Victor. Voss's voice sharpened, not loudly, but enough. Stop. He stopped. His hands were at his sides. His face had abandoned management entirely. And what was underneath it was not the calculated anger Emily had seen all year. It was something rawer, the fear of a man who has spent a long time controlling his environment and has just felt it tilt beyond his reach. She recognized it. She didn't feel satisfaction. She mostly felt tired and faintly sad, the way you feel sad about something wasteful. He left the room. External counsel followed. The room held itself for a moment. Then Voss looked at Emily directly for the first time in the meeting. Ms. Carter, she said, on behalf of the board, I want to extend a formal apology for the treatment you received in this facility. Emily didn't say anything immediately. I understand, Voss continued, if that doesn't cover the 11 months, but I want it on record. Put it on record, Emily said. Thank you. The lower level was quiet when she got back down there. Kowalski was still with Ranger. He'd set up a proper monitoring station, blood pressure cuff, cardiac leads, a tablet with a running vitals log. He'd also, Emily noticed, put a folded blanket down outside the kennel and left the kennel door partially open, which she was reasonably confident was either against regulation or right at its edge, but which meant that Ranger had his nose through the gap and was breathing the slightly less stale air of the corridor. Kowalski stood up when she came in. They told me what happened upstairs, he said. He said it carefully, with the quality of someone who has been revising the sentence for a while, and this is the version he landed on. How is he? She said. Stable. Heart rate's been consistent for the last hour, no further episodes. He paused. He's been watching the door. She crouched down. Ranger pressed his nose against her hand through the gate, and she scratched behind his ear in the particular spot she'd found years ago. The specific geography of affection that an animal memorizes faster and more reliably than almost anything else. His tail moved, not the exhausted single motion from before, a proper sweep. Hey, partner, she said quietly. Kowalski gave her space. He moved to the other side of the room and began charting something that could wait, because he was a decent enough person to understand that this was not a moment to be in. She stayed crouched there for a while. Her knees ached. The concrete was cold. Ranger breathed slowly against her fingers, and she listened to it. The steady rhythm of a living thing that had been looking for something for a long time and had found it again, however accidentally, however imperfectly, in the fluorescent half-light of a hospital basement in Montana. Ashford appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame rather than entering. He looked at the dog, then at her. Handler's been informed, he said. Tilly. He knows we found Ranger, and he knows you're here. How is he? Stable. They're saying 48 hours before he can be moved. Ashford paused. He cried when they told him Ranger was okay. Just so you know. She said nothing. The commendation paperwork is in process, he said. Sorrel is handling it personally. It'll be formal within the week. He paused. There's also a question, and this is not an order, it's a question, about whether you'd be willing to participate in the debrief. The full one for the unit's operational record. When? When you're ready, on your timeline. She looked at Ranger. Ask me next week. Okay. She stood up slowly. Her knees complained about the concrete, and she put a hand briefly on the kennel gate to steady herself. Ungracefully, just a person's hand on a metal gate, while her knees reminded her she was 30 and not 22 anymore. "Ashford," she said. "Yeah. The woman upstairs, the one you told me about." She turned to look at him. "The one who signed the original sealing order." His expression changed slightly. "Sorrel mentioned her." "Sorrel said the people who issued the order are no longer in their positions." Emily held his gaze. "That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking about the specific woman whose name was on that document, who authorized sealing my record and Tilly's record and 3 other people's records in a way that apparently wasn't even jurisdictionally valid." Ashford was quiet for a moment. "She retired," he said, 18 months ago. Before the review started. 6 weeks before. Emily absorbed that. "So she knew," Emily said. "We believe so. And the retirement was accepted, quietly. Yes." Ashford looked at her steadily. "That's the part of the picture Sorrel was telling you is full. It wasn't a clean resolution. It was a managed one. There's a difference." Emily stood in the quiet corridor of the lower level with the hum of the ventilation system and the soft sound of Ranger breathing. "A managed resolution," she said. "I know that's not—" "No," she said. "I know what it means. I've worked in managed resolutions." She picked up the monitoring chart from Kowalski's station and looked at Ranger's vitals without really reading them. "I just needed to know the shape of it." Kowalski's tablet chimed. They both looked at him. He was looking at the screen with a slight frown. "What?" Emily said. "Nothing. It's just—" He turned the tablet toward her. "The handler, Tilly, his vitals just spiked. They're calling it stress response, but—" He paused. "He's asking to be moved down here. He's asking to see the dog." Emily looked at Ashford. Ashford shook his head once. "He's 40 hours post-cardiac event. Moving him is— I know what it is." She was already moving toward the door. "Emily, he's asking to see his dog. After a cardiac event, that's not stress response. That's his nervous system trying to complete something." She was in the hallway. "Get me a portable cardiac monitor and a wheelchair, and whoever his attending physician is, and tell them I'll take clinical responsibility for the transport." "You've been suspended from—" "Then unsuspend me," she said, "or get out of the way." She was already at the stairwell door. She pushed it open, and she stopped. Because coming down the stairwell, not from the second floor, not from the administrative level, but from the roof, was a man she had not seen in the building before. He was in civilian clothes, not hospital clothes, and not federal clothes. And he was moving with the particular quality of someone who is trying not to be noticed, which in a hospital stairwell at this moment was not a quality that went unnoticed. He had a lanyard with a press credential. He had his phone out, and on the screen of the phone, visible for the half second before he registered her presence and pivoted, she saw the document. Not the full document, a portion of it, but enough. Enough to recognize the header, the departmental seal, the format of the records that had been sitting in Sorrel's briefcase 40 minutes ago in a closed administrative office. Someone had photographed Sorrel's documents. Someone had photographed her service record, and it was already on its way out of the building. Emily looked at the man. The man looked at Emily. For 1 second, they were both absolutely still. Then he ran. She moved before she finished thinking about it. That was the thing about certain kinds of training. It didn't wait for conscious authorization. Her body was already in the stairwell, already closing the distance before the analytical part of her brain had finished processing what she'd seen on the phone screen. The man was fast. He took the stairs upward rather than down, which was either panic or a plan. And she followed him because the roof was a dead end, and if it was panic, then she'd have him cornered in 30 seconds. And if it was a plan, then she needed to know what the plan was before it executed. He hit the roof door. She was 4 steps behind him. The roof was empty. The helicopter sat powered down where it had been for the past 2 hours, rotors still, no personnel visible. He ran toward the far edge of the pad, away from the door. She ran after him and registered, in the fraction of a second she had to register things, that he was not going for the edge. He was going for something on the far side of the maintenance housing, a compact, dark-colored bag that had been left against the base of the housing unit, half hidden by shadow, that had not been there when she and Ashford had come through this same door hours ago. He had staged it. This was the plan. He grabbed the bag without stopping and changed direction, angling back toward the stairwell door on the administrative side. The one that fed down into the main corridor, past the administrative offices, past the room where Sorrel's briefcase had been sitting open. Emily cut the angle. She hit him at the shoulder rather than the tackle she'd been aiming for. Her trajectory was off by about 18 inches because her left knee did what it sometimes did when she pushed it hard and she compensated mid-stride. They both went sideways rather than down, hard into the maintenance housing, metal against her shoulder, and the bag came loose from his hand and skidded across the roof pad. He threw an elbow that caught her cheekbone. She saw white for a second, just a second. Then she got her forearm up and used his momentum to put him face first into the wall of the housing unit, and she had his wrist at an angle that communicated clearly that the next move he made was going to be expensive, and she held it there, breathing hard, her cheek already throbbing. "Stop," she said. He stopped. "Don't," she said, because he'd started to shift weight. He stopped again. The roof door opened behind her. Ashford came through it at a run and then pulled up short when he saw them. Emily with her forearm across the man's back, the man's face against the housing wall, the bag 6 feet away on the pad. "I need a restraint and I need someone to get that bag without touching the phone inside it," Emily said. She didn't turn around. Her voice was level, but her breathing wasn't, and she could feel her pulse in her cheekbone. Ashford was on his radio in 3 seconds. He crossed to the bag and crouched over it without touching it. "It's open," he said. "I can see the phone." "Don't touch it." "I know." He looked up at her. "Your face." "I know," she said. "It's fine." It was not entirely fine. She could feel the swelling starting, the specific, unhelpful immediacy of facial bruising. She kept her forearm where it was and breathed and waited for the sound of boots on the roof stairs. They came within 90 seconds. 2 of Ashford's personnel, and behind them, Pruitt, who had apparently been close enough to respond to the radio call. Pruitt looked at the scene with the expression of a man who was rapidly revising his model of who exactly he had been escorting out of kennels. "Secure him," Ashford said. They did. Emily stepped back. She put her hand briefly to her cheekbone, not touching it, just assessing the heat, and then lowered it. The man was maybe 40. He had the kind of unremarkable face that people cultivate professionally. No uniform, no obvious affiliation, the press credential on his lanyard issued by a regional outlet that, when Ashford photographed it and sent it up the chain 30 seconds later, returned a flag within the minute. The outlet was real. The credential was not. "He came in through general visitor access," Ferris said, arriving on the roof slightly breathless. He'd run the building manifest from downstairs. Signed in as media, Press Pass cleared the desk because nobody flagged the visit. The admin office where Sorrel's briefcase was. It wasn't locked. Standard meeting room. Ashford looked at Emily. "He photographed the documents. I saw the header on the screen. At minimum, my service summary and the commendation file. Did he transmit?" "I don't know. He had the phone out. I don't know how long he had it." Ashford looked at his personnel. One of them was already on a tablet, working the question from the technical side. The other had the man by the arm and was not being rough about it, but there was nothing ambiguous about the grip. "Who sent you?" Ashford said to the man. Not aggressively, just flatly, the way you ask something when you already have several working hypotheses and want to see which one the answer eliminates. The man said nothing. "Okay," Ashford said. He looked at his personnel. "Take him down. Keep the phone isolated." He looked at Emily. "You need medical attention." "I need to check on Tilly." "Emily, your face." "Cheekbone. Not orbital, not zygoma. It'll bruise and it'll hurt and I'll live. I need to check on Tilly." She looked at him steadily. "Someone just photographed my service record in a building where a federal review is actively in progress. That is not an accident, and it is not a lone actor, which means Langley, or whoever is connected to Langley, already knew something was coming. That means the people who just documented my history could use it before the formal restoration is processed." Ashford was quiet for a moment. "Sorrel needs to know," Emily said. "Sorrel is already going to know. I'm going to call her in 30 seconds. Then go call her. I'm going to go check on a man who had a cardiac event 40 hours ago and is asking to see his dog. She didn't wait for a response. She went down the stairs, her cheek pulsing with each step, her knee doing the thing it did after it had been pushed, and she went down to the floor where Tilly was recovering, and she knocked on the door of his room with the back of her hand, gently. Marcus Tilly was 51 and looked older. That was the surgery, probably. Post-cardiac event plus the specific exhaustion of a man who'd spent 3 days in a facility that wasn't his bed, in a situation he had no control over, with the ambient terror of not knowing where his dog was layered under everything else. He was propped up in the bed at about 30 degrees, cardiac monitor clipped to his finger, and when Emily pushed open the door, his eyes went to her face immediately. "What happened to your face?" he said. His voice was hoarse. "Roof incident. It's handled." She came in and sat down in the chair beside the bed. "Ranger is stable. He had a seizure earlier, postictal now, vitals holding. He's been asking for you in the way dogs ask for things." Something moved across Tilly's face that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite grief. Some amalgamation of both that had been sitting in him since he woke up in the ER 2 days ago and been told his dog was in a secured kennel and his handler clearance didn't apply here. "He seized," Tilly said. "1 episode. He responded to diazepam, no recurrence. Kowalski has him on continuous monitoring." "Kowalski's good." "He is." She paused. "You know we can't move you down there tonight." "I know." "Your attending would have a reasonable objection." "I know that too." He looked at her. He had the particular quality of attention that people develop after years of reading environments fast, sizing up rooms, exits, threat levels, the thing that stays after the service is over and never quite goes back into the box. He was reading her now with it. "You served with Ashford's unit. You knew he was here?" "They told me. One of his people came up an hour ago." Tilly shifted slightly in the bed. "I knew someone had managed Ranger through the episode because Kowalski told me he was calm. Kowalski also told me he'd seen something that he was going to be processing for a while." He paused. "Only a few people could settle Ranger that fast. I went through the list." Emily said nothing. "Your name was on it," Tilly said. "I just didn't know you were here. Didn't know you were anywhere." He looked at his hands, large, calloused, the hands of someone who had spent years working with animals and equipment in conditions that weren't gentle. "They told me your record was sealed." "It was." "Past tense?" "Working on it." He was quiet for a moment. "The people here, the director, they treated you like—" "That's a different conversation," she said. "It's being handled." "You sure about that?" "Not entirely." He looked at her face again. "That's a bad bruise coming." "Yes." "You've had worse." "Also yes." She stood up. "I'll come back in the morning. If your attending clears a transport, we can get you down to the lower level tomorrow." Tilly caught her wrist. "Not hard. Just enough." "Carter," he said. "Thank you." "For him." She looked at his hand on her wrist. She looked at his face. There was nothing performative in it. It was just a man, tired and recovering, with the full weight of genuine gratitude that had nowhere theatrical to go. She had always found that harder to receive than the formal kind. "He would have done the same," she said. Which was true, and also not an answer, and they both knew it. She left him and went back down the corridor and found Ashford waiting for her at the elevator. Sorrel had already moved. By the time Emily and Ashford reached the administrative level, Sorrel had established an impromptu command space in the large conference room, her personnel on laptops, a secure line open on speaker, the room's whiteboard covered in a timeline she'd mapped in precise block lettering. She had the isolated phone in an evidence bag on the table, and she had, in the 30 minutes since the roof incident, done something to her affect that made her seem both more serious and more contained, which Emily hadn't thought was possible. "Transmission status," Ashford said as he came in. "Partial," Sorrel said. He initiated an upload before Carter stopped him. "We have the network log from the building system. The upload started but didn't complete. Best estimate is he got out roughly 40% of what he photographed." "What 40%?" Emily said. "The first portion of the service summary. Name, rank equivalent, unit designation. Not the operational details, not the commendations, not the classified field records. Sorrel looked at her. Your name and your unit, in a document with a federal departmental header, going to an unverified external recipient. Where does it go? Ashford said. We're working that. The outlet he used as cover, the press credential. It's a legitimate local news organization that had its credentials cloned. They have no knowledge of this. The recipient IP address is being traced. She paused. We've seen this method before. It's not amateur. Emily sat down. She put her elbows on the table and her hands over the lower part of her face and thought for a moment with the kind of focused, quiet thinking that other people sometimes mistook for shutdown, but was actually the opposite. Langley, she said, we don't know yet. Langley knew the board meeting was happening. He knew Sorrel was here. He had external counsel who arrived fast. Too fast for someone who drove in from the city on short notice. She looked up. He made a call before that meeting, before we were even in the room. Sorrel looked at her steadily. That's a serious allegation. It's a serious pattern, Emily said. He filed a retaliatory report within hours of the original incident. He had legal counsel on site within 90 minutes of a meeting that hadn't been announced. And now someone with a cloned press credential was in this building, in an unlocked meeting room with access to your briefcase during a federal review. She paused. That's not coincidence. That's someone who knew exactly what was in this building and exactly where to find it. The room was quiet. Sorrel looked at her personnel. Cross-referenced Langley's outgoing calls from the last 48 hours against the building's visitor log. His hospital phone will be in the system, Ferris said from the doorway. He'd come in behind them. He was suspended, but the access hadn't been technically revoked yet when he stopped. Actually, that's my fault. I should have flagged that immediately. Flag it now, Sorrel said. He was already on his phone. Emily leaned back in her chair. The bruise on her cheek had settled into a deep, persistent ache that she was managing by ignoring it, which was not a sustainable strategy, but was the only one available in the current context. She looked at the whiteboard, at Sorrel's timeline, at the names and dates mapped in clean block letters that represented 2 years of her life reduced to documentation. What happens to the partial transmission, she said. We intercept if we can. If it's already at the recipient, we issue a classification notice and pursue remediation through appropriate channels. Sorrel paused. The practical concern is timing. Your formal records restoration is being processed, but it won't be complete for several days. In the interim, if that partial document reaches a press outlet or a public platform, my name and a classified unit designation come out before the context does, Emily said. Yes. And someone can frame it however they want. Yes. Emily looked at Ashford. He was looking at the table. This was the contingency, she said. Not quite a question. Ashford looked up. What? When you talked to me on the roof this morning, you said you came yourself, not Ferris, not a liaison team. You came. She kept her voice level. You knew there was a risk the records coming out could be weaponized if the timing went wrong. That's why the 4 months, you weren't just building a case against Langley. You were waiting for a window where the restoration could happen faster than any leak. Ashford said nothing for a moment. We had 2 prior opportunities, he said. Both times, something in the external environment made the window close. Sorrel can speak to the specifics. I don't need the specifics, Emily said. I need to know that what's in that transmission doesn't land somewhere that spends the next 2 weeks making me the story instead of Langley. We're working on it, Sorrel said. Work faster, Emily said. She said it without heat, which somehow made it land cleaner than heat would have. Sorrel's phone rang. She looked at it and stepped to the side of the room. Emily stood up and went to the window. It looked over the same parking structure the director's office looked over. The Douglas firs beyond it were starting to lose their light, late afternoon going toward early evening, the particular blue-gray of Montana sky in autumn when it can't decide between overcast and clear. She looked at the trees and thought about 11 months of driving past them to a job that had been slowly, systematically made smaller. And she thought about Ranger in the basement with his nose through the kennel gate, and she thought about Tilly's calloused hand on her wrist. Then she heard Sorrel say, very precisely, "Say that again." She turned. Sorrel was facing the wall, phone pressed hard to her ear. "You're certain of the recipient?" Sorrel said. A pause. Send me the verification. Another pause. Longer. Sorrel lowered the phone. She turned around and her face had the particular quality of someone who has just received information that changes the geometry of a situation they thought they had mapped. The transmission recipient, she said. Everyone looked at her. It's not a press outlet, Sorrel said. It's not an external actor. She looked at Emily, then at Ashford. The IP traces back to an internal hospital server, administrative level, 3rd floor. Emily heard the room process that. She heard Ferris exhale. She heard Ashford put his tablet down on the table. He's still in the building, Ashford said. His access was suspended, Ferris said. It should have been revoked. Should have, Sorrel said. He had a secondary access pathway, Emily said. She said it quietly, almost to herself, and then louder. There are 2 systems in this hospital, the main administrative network and the legacy clinical system from before the 2019 infrastructure update. They were supposed to be unified, but the migration was never fully completed. I flagged it in my 3rd week here. She looked at Ashford. Guess whose budget decision delayed the migration? Ashford picked up his radio. The 3rd floor administrative corridor was mostly empty at this hour. The day staff had largely cleared out, and the evening shift ran lean on admin. But the light was on in the records management office at the end of the hallway, which connected to the hospital's legacy clinical server hub through a terminal that had not been active since 2021. Until 40 minutes ago. Prewitt was the first through the door, which said something about how completely his internal calculus had shifted in the past several hours. He came through with 2 of Ashford's personnel behind him, and what they found was not Victor Langley. It was Janet Malloy. She was the assistant director of operations. She had been at Redwood Regional for 9 years, which was 3 longer than Langley. She was 58, wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and had the institutional knowledge of someone who knew where everybody was buried because she had helped bury several of them. Emily had interacted with her exactly 6 times in 11 months, all transactional, all brief, and had clocked her as Langley's operational infrastructure rather than a decision-maker in her own right. That assessment was, clearly, incomplete. Malloy looked up from the terminal when the door opened. She looked at Prewitt. She looked at the 2 soldiers. She looked, when Emily came in behind them, at Emily. And her face did something that was not quite surprise and was not quite resignation, but was something in between, the face of someone who knew the odds and had played them anyway. She didn't run. She just took her hands off the keyboard and sat back in her chair. You should check the trash folder, she said. Not to Prewitt, to Emily, as though they were the only 2 people in the room who the situation was actually about. Before you assume I sent anything out, check what I actually did with it. Emily looked at the terminal. Then she looked at Ashford's personnel. Don't touch anything, she said. Get someone who can image the drive. It took 40 minutes to establish what had actually happened on the terminal. What Malloy had done was intercept. The transmission from the roof had been routed through the legacy system. Whoever had set that pathway up had known it existed and had used it as a relay, probably believing it was unmonitored. What they hadn't known was that Malloy had been running her own quiet surveillance on Langley's activities for approximately 3 months, using the same legacy access, and had caught the incoming transmission and killed it before it got out of the hospital's network. She had been building a file. The file was on the terminal, and it was substantial. Billing irregularities with documentation, incident reports that had been edited after initial filing, metadata timestamps that didn't match the visible modification dates. 3 separate instances of safety certifications that had been renewed with signatures from personnel who, when cross-referenced, had either left the hospital or had never been assigned to the relevant department. And a thread of internal communications between Langley and a contractor named Harwick Solutions that had nothing to do with anything a hospital director should have a thread of internal communications about. Sorrel looked at the file for 4 minutes without speaking. Then she looked at Malloy. Why? She said. Malloy took off her reading glasses and set them on the desk. Because I've been his operations person for 6 years, she said. I made things run. I fixed problems. I signed things he put in front of me because that was the job. She paused. And then about 8 months ago, he signed something I didn't fix and didn't put in front of me, and when I found out what it was, she stopped. There was a patient, incident report. He buried it. Not to protect the hospital, to protect a physician who was his personal referral and who generated a billing stream worth about $300,000 annually. The room was quiet. I didn't know how to go to the board without it coming back on me, Malloy said. So I collected. She looked at Emily again. I wasn't trying to destroy him. I just needed enough that I'd be believed when I said something. Emily looked at her for a long moment. She looked at the file on the screen. She looked at the 3 months of systematic patient documentation gathered by a woman who had been complicit in systems she'd eventually decided she couldn't keep running, and who had been sitting on evidence while trying to find a way to release it that wouldn't destroy her in the process. She understood that arithmetic better than she wanted to. The man on the roof, Emily said. Who sent him? Malloy's expression shifted slightly. That would be the Harwick Solutions connection. They have people who watch their interests. She looked at Ashford. When you landed, you weren't discreet. A military helicopter on a hospital in a small city, word travels. Harwick would have had eyes on this building within 2 hours. And Langley told them what was happening, Ashford said. Langley was scared, Malloy said. Scared people make calls they shouldn't make. Where is Langley now? Pruitt said. He said it with a quality in his voice that was new, not aggressive, but done. The quality of a man who had spent 2 days enforcing the wrong instructions and was working through the specific discomfort of that fact. His car is in the lot, Malloy said. He didn't leave after the board meeting. I saw him on the stairwell camera heading toward the medical records wing. Sorrel was already speaking into her phone. Emily was already in the doorway. Carter, Ashford said. Medical records wing, she said. He knows what Malloy has. If he thinks he has access to the physical files, let my people, your people don't know the layout of this floor, she said. I do. She was gone before he finished the sentence. The medical records wing was at the far end of the 3rd floor, separated from the administrative offices by a corridor that had the particular emptiness of an institutional space after hours. Lights on timers, half of them off, the rest casting the pale, yellowish half-light that made everything look like a still from a film about somewhere abandoned. Emily moved through it fast and quiet, her knee doing its thing, her cheek doing its thing, her attention doing the specific thing it did in spaces where she was moving toward rather than away from something uncertain. She found him in the records anteroom. He had not broken in. He had a key, his own key, the physical copy he'd never turned in because nobody had thought to ask for it in the chaos of the afternoon. He was at the physical filing system, the pre-digital archive that predated the current records management infrastructure, pulling folders. He didn't hear her come in. She stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment. He was moving with the urgent, slightly frantic energy of a man who is running a plan that he knows is already compromised but who has no other plan to run. His jacket was off. He'd loosened his tie. He had a stack of folders on the counter beside him, and he was photographing them with his phone. Victor, she said. He spun around. He looked at her across the anteroom. Her bruised face, her scrubs, the absolute steadiness of her, the way she was standing in his doorway at the end of a day that had taken everything he'd built and turned it over. And she watched him do the rapid, failing calculation of a man who is out of moves. Get out, he said. There are people 30 seconds behind me, she said. Whatever you're doing, these are my files. His voice had the sharp, slightly unhinged quality of someone who is using anger as structural support for something that is falling apart. This is my hospital. It's not anymore, she said. You don't get to... He stopped. He looked at her, and the managed anger was completely gone now, and what was underneath it was the thing she'd seen briefly in the board meeting before he'd left the room. The fear. The genuine, unmanaged fear of a man who had spent 6 years controlling information and was now watching that control end. You don't understand what it took to run this place. The board doesn't understand. The military certainly doesn't. I don't need to understand, she said. I need you to put the folders down. You're a nurse, he said. You have been a nurse in my hospital for 11 months. You don't have the... Victor. Her voice was quiet. Put the folders down. He looked at her. The door behind her opened. Ashford's personnel came through it, and behind them Pruitt, and behind him Sorrel, who took in the scene and walked directly to the counter and stood beside the folders without touching them, looking at Langley with the patient, exact expression of someone who has arrived at the final step of a long process. Langley put the folders down. His phone was still in his hand. "I'll need that," Sorrel said. He looked at it. Then he set it on the counter beside the folders, the careful, slightly stunned movement of someone who is putting down something they have been holding for a very long time. "Victor Langley," Sorrel said, "I'm formally notifying you that you are the subject of an active federal review relating to fraudulent documentation, obstruction of an official investigation, and potential coordination with a third-party contractor, Harwick Solutions, in the unauthorized acquisition of classified personnel documents. You are advised to retain counsel immediately and to make no further attempts to access any physical or electronic records in this facility." The room was very quiet. Langley looked at Emily. She met his eyes. She didn't look away. She didn't look triumphant, and she didn't look forgiving. She looked like what she was, a tired woman with a bruised cheek at the end of a very long day, standing in a records anteroom, watching something she'd been waiting for without quite letting herself admit she'd been waiting for it. He looked away. Prewitt took him by the arm, gently, with the same not rough quality that the soldiers had used on the roof. Langley went without pulling against it. He had the appearance of a man who has been subtracted from himself. They walked him out. Emily stood in the empty records anteroom with Sorrel and the residual weight of everything that had just happened in the past 8 hours in this building. She put one hand on the counter and let it take a little of her weight. "Harwick Solutions," she said. "What is it?" "A government contracting firm that has been under federal scrutiny for 18 months for irregularities in service contracts across 3 states, Sorrel said. Langley was a referral node. He directed hospital service contracts their way in exchange for arrangements we're still documenting. She paused. They have people who protect their interests when reviews get close. The man on the roof was one of them. "Why my records?" Emily said. "What was in my service summary that was worth protecting?" Sorrel looked at her steadily. "The unit you served with did consulting assessments on medical supply contracting for forward operating bases. Harwick had a competitor bidding on those same contracts. If a decorated member of that unit reappeared publicly as part of a federal review at a hospital with Langley-Harwick connections, it puts a credible witness in proximity to the contracting record," Emily said. Yes, she absorbed this. She stood in the anteroom with the physical files spread on the counter and thought about the specific, unglamorous way that institutional corruption works. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a slow accumulation of small accommodations that eventually weigh more than everything else. "The patient," Emily said. "The one in Malloy's file. The incident report Langley buried." Sorrel looked at her. "That needs to be the first thing that goes to the board," Emily said. "Before the contracting review, before the personnel documents, before any of this." She looked at Sorrel steadily. "There's a person at the center of that report. Whatever happened to them is the actual story." Sorrel held her gaze for a moment. "Agreed," she said. Emily straightened up. She took her hand off the counter. She looked at the doorway where Langley had gone, then at the window, then at nothing in particular. "I need to go check on Ranger," she said. She walked out. She was in the corridor halfway to the stairwell when her pager buzzed. She looked at it. It was the ICU extension. Tilly's floor. Her pace changed. She pushed through the stairwell door and took the stairs 2 at a time, her knee objecting and her cheek pulsing and her heart doing something specific that she recognized as the particular frequency of fear that has a name attached to it. She hit the ICU floor, turned the corner, and found Danica standing outside Tilly's room with an expression that Emily could not immediately read. It wasn't the expression of a medical emergency. It wasn't the expression of bad news. It was something else. "He's okay," Danica said, quickly, reading Emily's face. "He's fine. He insisted." She gestured at the door. He apparently told his attending that if they didn't get him into a wheelchair and down to the lower level, he was going to walk, which was enough of a credible threat that... Emily pushed the door open. Tilly was not in the bed. He was in the wheelchair beside the bed, already dressed in a hospital gown and compression socks, his cardiac monitor transmitting wirelessly to a portable unit clipped to the chair, his IV line threaded carefully through the armrest. He looked at Emily with an expression that was entirely unapologetic. "I know what you're going to say," he said. Do you? She said, and my attending has already said it. Good. Then you have context for what I'm about to say. Carter. He looked at her, and the unapologetic expression had something behind it that she couldn't dismiss, the same thing she'd felt in his hand on her wrist earlier. Let me go see my dog. She stood in the doorway of his room and looked at him, and thought about all the things that were medically inadvisable and all the things that were, in the longer and more complicated calculus that she had been applying to decisions for most of her adult life, simply true. His attending appeared behind her in the doorway. Dr. Osei, of all people. Marcus Osei, who had spent 11 months barely registering her existence, who was now looking at her with an expression that had something genuinely different in it from anything she'd seen from him before. Something that had traveled some distance to get there. Wireless monitoring, continuous, Osei said to her. Not to Tilly. To her, as though her assessment was the one that mattered. I'll come down with him personally. 30 minutes maximum. Emily looked at Tilly. Tilly looked at Emily. She stepped aside. She walked with them down to the elevator and down to the lower level and down the corridor to the kennel where Ranger had his nose through the gap in the gate and his ears forward. And the moment Tilly's wheelchair came within 10 feet, the dog made a sound. Not a bark, something lower, something that had 7 years of work and deployment and separation compressed into it. And Tilly said nothing, just put his hand through the gate and pressed it against the dog's muzzle, and neither of them moved for a long time. Emily stood back and watched. Kowalski was watching from the corner, pretending to chart. Osei had his eyes on the portable monitor. Danica had come down without explanation and was standing near the door. After a while, Tilly said quietly, "Open the gate." "Marcus?" Emily said. "Emily." He said her name the way people say a name when they want the sentence to stop. "Open the gate." She opened the gate. Ranger put his head in Tilly's lap and stayed there, and Tilly put both hands on the dog's head and closed his eyes. And it was not a perfect moment. The lighting was wrong, the setting was a hospital basement, Tilly was in a gown and compression socks, and the portable monitor was beeping with the slightly irritating regularity of cardiac equipment in quiet spaces. It was not any version of a movie reunion. It was just two old partners finding each other after a long time, in the only way that mattered. Emily looked at her pager to give them privacy. There was a message from Sorrel. IP confirmation on Harwick personnel. 3 additional individuals in the building. Not the roof. Lower level access. Maintenance corridor. Move now. She read it twice. She looked up. The maintenance corridor was 12 feet to her left. The door at the end of it, she now registered, was not fully closed. She didn't announce it. She looked at the door at the end of the maintenance corridor for 2 seconds, assessed the gap, assessed the direction the light was hitting it, and then she looked back at the kennel. Tilly had his eyes closed. Osei was watching the monitor. Danica was looking at her phone. Kowalski was still pretending to chart. She crossed to Danica in 3 quiet steps. "Get everyone away from that corridor," she said, low and close. "Tilly, Osei, Kowalski. Move them toward the elevator. Don't explain. Just do it now." Danica looked at her face and read whatever was in it and didn't ask a single question. She turned and said something to Osei about the monitor readout, which was true enough to hold, and Osei came over, and the quiet natural gravity of a physician expressing clinical concern was enough to draw Kowalski in too. And within 45 seconds, the small cluster of people had shifted 15 feet toward the elevator without any of it looking like anything other than a medical consultation. Emily texted Sorrel, "Lower level, maintenance corridor. I'm here." Then she put her phone in her pocket and positioned herself against the wall beside the corridor door, out of the line of sight from anyone coming through it, and waited. She was aware this was not ideal. She had no equipment, a bruised cheekbone, a knee that had been uncooperative since the roof, and the last significant physical confrontation she'd had was approximately 2 hours ago and had not left her in peak condition. She was also aware that waiting for Sorrel's people to arrive and doing nothing in the meantime was a reasonable option, and she was aware that she was not choosing it. Because Tilly was 20 feet away in a wheelchair with a cardiac monitor, and Ranger was in an open kennel, and the maintenance corridor connected to the kennel storage area, and whoever was on the other side of that door had been sent by people who, as of an hour ago, had already demonstrated their willingness to do things that required a man on a roof with a cloned press credential. She was not going to wait 20 feet from Tilly and Ranger while she did math about whether she was in good enough shape to be useful. The door moved. It opened slowly, which was worse than fast. Fast was adrenaline and noise. Slow was intent and method. The first figure that came through was checking the corridor before committing to it, which meant trained rather than opportunistic, which meant she had maybe 2 seconds before he completed the check and moved. She put her elbow into the door. The door swung back hard and caught him in the shoulder rather than the face because he'd been pulling back already. Trained, she'd been right. And he went sideways but didn't go down. She came through the doorway and put him into the shelving along the left wall of the storage area. And she heard the second figure behind her and she didn't have time to turn, so she dropped instead, got low, and felt the grab go over her head. And then she was behind him, and she had his arm at an angle that she'd used on the roof and that her shoulder did not enjoy, and that she held anyway. The third one was at the back of the storage area, near the far door. She looked at him. He was bigger than the other two, and he had stopped moving when she dropped, which meant he was thinking, and thinking was more dangerous than moving. He had his eyes on her and his weight shifted forward, and she made the fastest inventory she'd ever made of a 12-foot space, shelving, equipment carts, a defibrillator in a red case, mop bucket, cable ties on a hook. And she moved. She went for the defibrillator, not to use it as a weapon. She yanked it off the shelf and it hit the floor with a crash that was not subtle and was entirely intentional, because it was loud enough to bring whatever was outside that door inside in under a minute. And because the red case in the hand of a hospital employee in a maintenance corridor was a signal that had a very specific meaning in any institutional environment. Something is medically wrong. Someone is responding. This is not the moment to do what you came here to do. The big one hesitated. He hesitated for exactly long enough. The door behind him opened and Ashford's 2 personnel came through it in full. And it was not elegant. It was a tight space, and there were bodies and equipment carts, and it was loud, and the man with the wrist angle she was holding did something with his elbow that got him partially free, and she caught it on her forearm rather than her face, which was an improvement but only just. But it was sufficient. 3 minutes of controlled chaos in a hospital storage room, and then 3 men were against the wall, and she was standing in the middle of the room with a defibrillator at her feet and her shoulder doing something she was going to have to address tomorrow, and her heart running considerably faster than it had been 30 seconds ago. Sorrel came through the maintenance door at a walk, which somehow communicated both that she'd been close the whole time and that she'd known Emily would handle it. She looked at the 3 men. She looked at Emily. She looked at the defibrillator on the floor. "Please tell me that thing is okay," she said. "It's fine," Emily said. She picked it up and checked it. "It's fine." Sorrel exhaled through her nose. "Harwick's people," she said, "all 3 confirmed from earlier surveillance. They came through the building's utility access." She looked at Emily steadily. "You could have waited." "I know," Emily said. "You were going to wait, and then you didn't." Tilly's 20 feet away. Sorrel looked at her for a moment. "I know," she said, with a dryness that acknowledged the point, while also being clear she found the result professionally stressful. "Go get your shoulder looked at." Emily set the defibrillator back on the shelf and went back through the door. Chad. The following 4 days were the institutional equivalent of a flood receding. Slow, revealing, and leaving things behind that hadn't been visible before. Langley was formally terminated by the board on the morning of the second day, in a closed session that lasted 40 minutes and produced a 6-page summary that would eventually be made available to staff. The same session suspended 2 additional administrators pending review. Both had been signatories on documentation that Malloy's file had flagged as manipulated. The safety certification irregularities were referred to the State Health Authority. The patient incident report that Langley had buried was pulled, reviewed, and referred to the Ethics Committee with a note that the patient's family would be contacted directly. Harwick Solutions received a formal federal notification of expanded inquiry. Their government contracting licenses were suspended pending review. The man from the roof and the 3 from the maintenance corridor were in federal custody by end of day 1, And the investigation into their coordination with hospital personnel was, according to Sorrell in a brief update that she delivered to Emily, with the efficiency of someone who gives these updates the way other people send emails, proceeding. Sorrell said, proceeding the way other people say, not your problem anymore. Emily decided to accept that. The formal records restoration was completed on day 3. Emily was in the break room eating a granola bar she'd been carrying in her pocket for 4 hours when Ferris found her and put the document in front of her on the table. It was not dramatic. It was printed on standard paper, and it had a departmental header, and it meant that the 7 years of her life that had been administrative, nothing were, as of that morning, officially somewhere. She read it twice. She folded it in half. "Thank you," she said. Ferris sat down across from her. He had the air of someone who has been peripherally involved in something significant and is still processing what exactly his peripheral involvement means about his judgment. "How's the shoulder?" "Functional." "And the cheek?" "Colorful." It was, in fact, at peak bruise that morning, a deep purple yellow that she'd looked at in the bathroom mirror with the resigned acknowledgement that she would be fielding comments about it for another week. "The board wants to meet with you," he said. "I know. Danica told me." "It's not a review, it's... I know what it is." She finished the granola bar. "What time?" "Whenever you're ready." She looked at the folded document on the table. She looked at the window of the break room, which looked into the main corridor where she could see Danica at the nursing station, talking to a resident, moving through the ordinary work of a hospital floor with the particular efficiency of someone who is genuinely good at what she does, and does it without requiring it to be noticed. 10 o'clock, Emily said. "I have a patient at 9. What?" The board meeting was not what she had expected, which was itself the main thing she took away from it. She had expected apology in the institutional form, carefully worded, liability-conscious, the kind of language that says everything and means nothing because it was vetted by legal before it was spoken. She had expected formality that kept a specific distance. What she got instead was Margaret Voss sitting across a table without a prepared statement, looking at her over reading glasses and saying, "I want to know what you actually want, not what we can offer you, what you want." Emily looked at her. "Because what we can offer you is a significant renegotiation of your contract, a formal staff apology, a posted statement of your record and commendations on hospital communication channels, and a departmental review of the conditions under which you worked for the past 11 months. Voss paused. "All of that is going to happen regardless. I'm asking what else." Emily thought about it. Not for performance, but she actually thought about it, which took a moment. "The patient in Malloy's file," she said. "I want confirmation that their family is contacted personally, and not through a letter. I want a person to make that call." Voss wrote something. "The documentation irregularities in the incident reporting system. There needs to be an independent audit, not internal, external." Voss wrote something. "And the staff who were pressured to file or sign documentation they didn't agree with. I want a formal protection process before any of the disciplinary reviews reach them. They were doing what they were told by someone who had institutional authority over their livelihoods." Voss looked up. "That last one is going to complicate the review process." "I know," Emily said. "I want it anyway." Voss held her gaze for a moment and then wrote it down. "And for yourself." Emily looked at the window. The Douglas firs were visible from this floor. The sky behind them was the particular clear blue of a Montana morning in early autumn, the kind that makes the light sharp and the distances seem closer than they are. "My contract reinstated with back pay from suspension," she said. "And I want to work with Kowalski on the lower-level protocols for medical working dogs. We don't have any. We should." Voss almost smiled. "Done." Or, the commendation ceremony happened on a Thursday. It was outside, which had been Emily's one specific request, and it was smaller than Ashford had originally proposed, which had also been her request. No press. No prepared speeches longer than 2 minutes. The hospital's outer courtyard, a rectangle of pavement and garden boxes that mostly got used by staff on smoke breaks, and was therefore already equipped with folding chairs that Kowalski had arranged in rows the morning of, somewhat crookedly, because he'd done it alone and hadn't measured anything. The chairs were imperfect. The autumn light was good. There were maybe 60 people. Hospital staff, Ashford's personnel, Sorrel and two of her people, Ferris, Tilly in his wheelchair with a blanket over his knees, and the expression of a man who had been told by his attending that this was a 1-hour maximum event and intended to stay for 3. Ranger was there. He was on a leash, formally speaking, but the leash was in Emily's hand and served more as a gesture toward protocol than an actual restraint. He sat beside her chair with the composed authority of an animal who understood that something significant was happening and was choosing to participate rather than merely attend. Ashford read the commendation. He read it straight, without embellishment, which was how she'd asked him to do it, and the words were the words of a document that described specific things, dates, locations, actions, outcomes, in the way that official military language describes things, precisely and without sentiment, which somehow made the sentiment heavier. She listened to it and looked at her hands. When he finished, he looked at her. "You never stopped being one of us," he said. That part was not in the document. That part was just him, in front of 60 people saying a true thing. She looked up. She did not cry, because she had spent 7 years building the infrastructure not to. And that infrastructure did not disassemble in a courtyard on a Thursday. But there was something in her face that she didn't manage to contain entirely. Something that Danica, sitting 2 chairs away, registered and looked away from with the specific tact of a person who understands that the greatest kindness in that moment is not witnessing it. Emily stood up. Ashford pinned the commendation to her scrub jacket, which was not the intended garment for military commendations, but was what she was wearing because she'd come from a 7 a.m. shift, and the small inappropriateness of it, the formal medal on the hospital scrubs, was somehow the truest version of the whole story. Applause. Real applause, not the cautious institutional kind. Danica was on her feet. Kowalski was on his feet. Tilly was trying to stand up and being gently prevented by Osei, who was standing beside him with his hand on Tilly's shoulder, and Tilly was arguing with him in the affectionate, losing way that patients argue with doctors they've started to like. Emily looked at the crowd and felt the particular uncomfortable weight of being seen by people who had previously looked through her, and she sat with it rather than deflecting it, because she had earned the right to sit with it, and refusing it would have been its own kind of dishonesty. She looked down at Ranger. He looked up at her with amber eyes, and his tail swept the courtyard pavement once, twice, the steady rhythm of a dog who is exactly where he intended to be. She scratched his ear in the right spot. Later, when the chairs were being folded and people were drifting back inside, and Tilly was finally being wheeled in by Osei with the resigned dignity of a man who lost the time argument but won everything else, Sorrel found her near the garden boxes. "The Harwick investigation is expanding," Sorrel said. "Not just the contracting records. They found connections in 2 other states." She paused. "There may be a formal request for your testimony regarding the unit's contracting assessments. Not immediately. Months from now, potentially." "I know," Emily said. "You'll cooperate?" "Yes." Sorrel nodded. She looked at the courtyard, the crooked chairs being folded, the autumn light going slightly gold at the edges now, Kowalski stacking the chairs with the earnest, slightly inefficient energy of a person who volunteers for logistics without having a system. "You know what I've been doing for 14 years?" she said. Emily looked at her. "Reviews, investigations, accountability processes." Sorrel said it without bitterness, but also without the performance of finding meaning in it. "Most of them don't end like this. Most of them end with a managed resolution and a departed employee and a policy update that nobody reads." She looked at Emily. "This one is different. Not because the right person won. Winning that's not the framework that holds up over time." She paused. "It's different because the truth came out through channels that were supposed to bury it. And it came out because 2 or 3 people who had nothing institutional to gain kept being exactly what they were when it would have been easier not to be." Emily said nothing. "That's not a small thing," Sorrel said. "I just want to say that since I'm usually the one who tells people what the limitations are." She offered her hand. Emily shook it. Sorrel walked back inside, and Emily stood in the courtyard with the commendation on her scrub jacket and Ranger at her feet, and the gold-edged afternoon light of Silver Creek, Montana, coming through the gap in the Douglas firs, and she thought about what Sorrel had said, keeping being exactly what they were when it would have been easier not to be. She had not always been good at knowing what she was. She'd been good at the work, the medical work, the field work, the particular discipline of staying functional in conditions that require discipline. She'd been good at building a quiet life out of what the institutional machinery had left her with after it sealed her records and moved on. But knowing what she was, underneath all of that, what remained when you stripped away the job description and the credentials and the years of not being looked at, that had been harder. Standing in the courtyard, she thought she had a better answer for it now than she'd had 11 months ago when she drove into Silver Creek in February with a reference letter from a clinic in Billings and a bag of 2 large scrubs. She was someone who stayed. Not because staying was always right, and not because she'd done it without cost, and not because the institutions that were supposed to protect her had earned her continued presence in them. She had stayed because the work was real. Tilly, Ranger, the patient in Malloy's buried report, the staff who'd signed documents under pressure and were now going to get a formal protection process before anyone reviewed their actions. All of it was real, and real things required presence, and presence was what she had given for 11 months in a hospital that had spent the same 11 months pretending she wasn't there. She looked at the commendation. It was a piece of metal on a scrub jacket. It was also proof, in the specific way that formal documentation is proof, that the years that had been taken from the record had not actually been taken. They'd been there the whole time. They'd been in a sealed file and in a dog's memory, and in the particular quality of stillness she'd never managed to unlearn. And now they were in a courtyard in Montana with 60 people and the wrong kind of lighting and crooked chairs. That was enough. It was not everything, but it was enough. And she had learned, over 30 years of living imperfectly in a complicated world, that enough and everything were not the same thing, and that confusing them was where a lot of grief lived. She crouched down. Ranger turned toward her, already anticipating it. The knowledge of the specific spot, the specific pressure, the specific person. She unclipped the formal leash and replaced it with the worn everyday lead she'd had in her scrub pocket since morning, the one she'd bought at the hardware store on Route 9 3 days ago, the one that was slightly too long and would need adjusting. She put her hand on his head. "Come on," she said. "Let's go back to work." He stood. He shook once, the full-body reset of a dog dismissing formality in favor of function. He looked up at her with his ears forward and his weight tipped toward moving, ready. She walked back into the hospital. He walked beside her, matching her stride, and the glass door of Redwood Regional Medical Center opened in front of them, and the light changed from courtyard gold to interior white, and the sounds of a working hospital replaced the sounds of the courtyard. The PA system, the rolling carts, the particular frequency of a building full of people doing necessary things. Danica was at the nursing station. She looked up. She didn't say anything immediately. She looked at the commendation on Emily's jacket. She looked at Ranger. She looked at Emily's face, the bruise still there, still colorful, the tiredness that hadn't entirely left, the thing that was in her expression now that hadn't been there before, which was not happiness exactly, and not peace exactly, but something more durable than either. "You've got a patient in Bay 3, Danica said. "I know," Emily said. "I'll be right there." She stopped at the supply cart and pulled what she needed and moved down the corridor with the same quiet walk she'd had since February. No announcement, no performance, just the particular efficiency of someone who knows where she is going and why. But it was different now. Not because the hospital had changed, not because the corridor was different, or the light was different, or the work was different. The work was the same. It was always going to be the same. Difficult, imperfect, shot through with moments of genuine crisis and long stretches of ordinary labor, and the occasional patient who required everything she had, and the daily reality that medicine is not about winning, it is about staying present for the full duration of what another person is going through. It was different because she was not invisible anymore, and because she had understood something in that courtyard that she had known intellectually for a long time but had not quite let become true in her body, that the years they took from her record had not taken anything from her. The competence was hers, the knowledge was hers, the steadiness that she'd shown in a corridor with a military dog, and in a kennel floor during a seizure, and in a storage room with a defibrillator and bad odds, None of that had been granted to her by the institution that had eventually recognized it. It had been hers all along. She had shown up every day for 11 months in a building that had decided she was small, and she had done the work anyway. Not because she was waiting for recognition, and not because she had some strategy for eventual vindication. She had done it because the patients were real, and the work was real, and doing it poorly would have been a kind of self-betrayal she was not willing to commit. That was the whole story. The elaborate machinery of Langley's corruption, and Harwick's intervention and sealed records and federal reviews, all of it was real, and all of it had mattered, and all of it had led to a Thursday courtyard with a commendation and 60 people in crooked chairs. But the story under the story was simpler. It was a woman who knew what she was and didn't stop being it when it cost her. And it had cost her. And she had paid that cost. And she was still here. The patient in Bay 3 had a dislocated shoulder and was trying hard not to cry about it, which Emily recognized as both understandable and unnecessary. She pulled the curtain closed behind her and snapped on gloves. "Hi," she said. "I'm Emily. Let's see what we're working with." The patient looked at her face, at the bruise, at the commendation glinting on her jacket, at whatever combination of weariness and competence she was carrying in her expression at 4 o'clock on a Thursday, and said, "Are you okay?" Emily looked at them. She considered a lot of answers. "Getting there," she said. "Now, deep breath for me." She went to work. Outside the curtain in the corridor, Ranger lay down against the wall with his chin on his paws, patient and alert, waiting for her the way good partners wait, without anxiety, without doubting that she would come back, just present, just there. In the end, after everything, the sealed files and the buried reports, and the 11 months of being looked through and the roof and the storage room and the courtyard, that was the thing that held. Not the commendation, not the formal restoration of record, not even the public accounting for everything that Langley had done and everything Harwick had tried to do. What held was simpler than all of it, the work, the knowledge, and the decision to keep showing up for both. That decision had never belonged to anyone but her. It still didn't. And that was the thing they had never been able to take. No matter who has overlooked you, underestimated you, or tried to write you out of your own story, your record is not what they say about you. It's what you do when it would be easier to stop. Stay in the corridor, do the work. The truth has a way of finding its own way out.